Welcome, my friends, to the Quay Radio Hour, your home for free and critical thinking, and I'm your host, Mike Williams. Tonight, my guests are Sofia Smallstorm and David Weiss. Our discussion is a roundtable format where we share our thoughts and ideas on the giant tree concept. The premise of giant trees that once stood on Earth came to light approximately 2 weeks ago with the video entitled, "There Are No Forests on Earth." The video has taken the alternative community by storm and has resulted in a lot of internet buzz, along with the typical debating and hand-wringing. So the three of us, with some additional research under our belt, decided it would be interesting to sit down and share our collective thoughts on the topic. None of us are positing a definitive position on the giant trees. We just thought it would be interesting to sit down as friends and have an open discussion. And so without further ado, here's the conversation with Sofia and David. About 2 weeks ago, there was a video that had come out. It was called "There Are No Forests on Earth." And it was a video I almost didn't take a look at. I just didn't take the title of the video very seriously. And then a little voice in my head was saying, "Go ahead, Mike, play it, take a look at it." And it was very interesting. And the video was about the fact that we have, or had, on Earth giant trees. And they are in the form of Devil's Tower and mesas and so on, all around the world. So what I'd like to do with this show, with the help of you guys, and I know the three of us have been looking into various aspects of that video, doing some research as much as we can. We haven't, or at least I haven't, landed on anything specifically. I just find it very intriguing and very interesting. So I know a lot more research has got to be done. And me personally, I'm not going to have any definitive position on this. We spoke before the show, and I said that if somebody asks me, I could say that it does look like a tree trunk to me. But whether it is an actual tree trunk, I don't know, because I don't believe I have enough facts yet to be able to draw that conclusion. So what are your thoughts, Sofia? We'll start with you ladies first. When you saw that video, I gave you my impressions. What did you think when you saw the video?
Well, I heard him say multiple times in the beginning, "There are no forests on Earth." And I thought, what is he talking about? We see forests. We see them, in pictures, and we've been hiking through them, and we fly over them when we're in a plane. What is he talking about? And then I started to get it. He was talking about scale. And it's really a matter of scale. So as I watched the video, I became more and more fascinated because he is demonstrating through these relics that we call mesas. That's how he starts out. These flat-topped mountains. You see them in Arizona. They're typical desert topography. But they're not just in the desert. They're in all kinds of places. And they have these ridgy sides. And he points out that these are chopped off tree trunks. And when he says that, boom, your mind does this triple somersault. And now it sees exactly what he's talking about. And so it started to sink in for me what he means when he says there are no forests. What he means is that the stuff we call forests today, compared to the scale of the trees that used to grow here, this is effectively moss. This is moss or grass. And he makes a beautiful case in those first, I don't know if it's 15 or 20 minutes of the video. It's just mind-blowing. And you get that he's done a beautiful job with the delivery because your whole head explodes. So I'll save some of my theorizing for a little later in this show, but I just wanted to give you that right now.
Yeah, he did present it very well. He took it very methodically and very incrementally. It was very well thought out as he stepped the viewer through the next steps where he was going to take you. So, I mean, what it did right out of the chute was it kept you interested in the video. I never lost interest. It was about, I guess, 90 minutes or so.
An hour and 17 minutes.
An hour and 17 minutes, okay. So, David, what were your thoughts?
I had the same feeling that Sofia had and you and most people that saw it. What really struck me is how much it affected me deep down inside. And I have to trust those deep down emotions sometimes. I really feel that there's something to it, but I don't want to jump to the conclusion that these are giant tree stumps. I have seen some other explanations that don't hold much weight for me. Nothing that's really a better or even close to a reasonable explanation of what formed these things. All of the ancient texts, which I've never really looked into before, talk about giant trees. There's Vedic texts, and I'm not a Bible scholar in any way, shape, or form, but they talks about it in there. There's the movie Avatar is talking about giant trees and strip mining the earth, and there's a lot of truth in movies. So I don't know. I think it's worth looking into for a while and see what comes out of it.
Now, the other thing is, aside from the very large trees, his other point is that we live in a giant quarry, which means that where we are, it was mined. And these trees came down maybe before the process, during the process, or whatever. So that's another thing I think we can get into is Earth is a quarry, according to that video.
I'd like to jump in and point out that the second phase of his explanation was mountains, that the flat top mesas are chopped off trees, but our mountain ranges are broken off trees. And he posited that the trees originated as a silicon life form, which I looked into a little bit, and I looked into the bonding capabilities of silicon versus carbon, because we're said now to have carbon-based life. And both are tetravalent in their bonding ability, meaning they make 4 bonds, which are very stable. But silicon life, even though it's been a subject I learned of science fiction, that it's part of the whole science fiction fantasy material that life could be made of silicon, the carbon that we absolutely do rely on in our biology is much more flexible and supportive of enzymatic activities than silicon would be. So as you look, I'm not a chemist, but I try to understand why would this work, why wouldn't this work. So my own theory goes in a slightly different direction from his, but that's just a supposition. It's just one of my own, well, okay, what does this possibly lead to? And I'll still save it for later in the show.
Yeah, so maybe we should jump into the silicon piece of this, because that was a big portion or a big aspect of what these trees are supposedly made up of. So they are not carbon-based. He's saying that they are silicon-based. And let me just do this real quick, because maybe a lot of folks in the audience are not familiar with silicon. Maybe they've heard the word, but they don't know a lot about what exactly makes up silicon. What is it? And to be honest with you, I didn't have a great understanding of it either until I started digging in and doing some research on it. So let me just read a couple of things off, and then you guys can jump in after we kind of build a baseline here for the audience. Silicon is a naturally occurring chemical element. It's abundant on Earth. It's 135 times more abundant than carbon. It's primarily found in rocks, and let's keep that in the back of our mind, because he was saying that the rocks on Earth came from these trees. So silicon is primarily found in rocks. Silicon is very attracted to oxygen and combines readily with oxygen. It forms silicon dioxide, which is SiO2. The most common form of SiO2 or silicon dioxide is quartz. Elemental silicon is a major player in modern electronics. So when we talk about semiconductors, and when it's heated into a molten state, silicon can be formed into semiconductor wafers to serve as a base for integrated circuits or microchips. Silicon excels in intense heat. And I have a theory about this, because the trees were so high that I could make a case that it's so hot that maybe the silicon helped the trees to withstand the heat. But we'll get into that a little later. Now, the thing with silicon that I found out is that it has a weaker bond than carbon. So carbon to carbon has a much greater bond. As an example, diamonds. And also, silicon is unstable in most liquids, including water. And then, as you had mentioned, Sofia, that silicon-based life is written about and contemplated by a lot of researchers and scientists in the realm of possible alien types of life. But science fiction really digs into it. And I have a bullet here on H.G. Wells and how he had written about silicon-based life. So I guess the net of it, what I'm trying to say here after all these bullets is silicon is not rare. It's very, very common and abundant here on Earth. So that's one of the things I wanted to kind of get my head wrapped around, because if he's talking about silicon-based trees, well, I wanted to know how pervasive is silicon, and the answer is very.
Well, I poked into silicon quite a bit, and it is abundant, but its inability to flex with the biological processes is one reason why it couldn't support our kind of life. So my theory is that these trees siliconized, meaning they crystallized, after some kind of conflagration occurred on the planet intended to take them down, on the plane, as some people would prefer that I say. So, as we know, the nanotechnological world is pushing us increasingly into tolerance of piezoelectric, crystalline materials that are being embedded in our tissues. This is the underlying theory behind the Morgellons syndrome prevalence. I introduced it in a talk that I gave called From Chemtrails to Pseudo-Life, which is on YouTube in 2 different parts. But we are being encouraged to tolerate frequencies of all kinds of oscillations that are not natural and not found in nature, that are man-made, such that we will create piezoelectric exchanges and materializations in our bodies. Piezoelectricity is the application of frequency to crystals to create voltage, and life is voltage. It's the exchange of electricity on the cellular level. So as we are pushed into a world that contains more and more unnatural frequencies, our tolerance of these frequencies is being observed and tested. And my theory is that silicon life is what is impending. It isn't what happened before.
Okay, so it's not what was, it's what's coming.
Right. And I don't know, again, I'm not a chemist. I'm just a person who sits here and dibble-dabbles and thinks. But I believe, Mike, I'm going to let my little download out, that maybe if the trees were as large as they are, as they seem to have been, other life forms may have been just as large and florid and lush. So whatever the earth was at one time, it had very large life forms on it. And then suddenly something happened and the large life forms died, and there may have been a rest period, a rehab period, a recovery period. But then, guess what? This is my theory, that the same forms appeared all over, but in miniature, that we miniaturized. So now our trees, which look very much like the big trees, are teeny, teeny, tiny little miniature forms of their former selves. And we may have had at one time, not just the proportions that would match the size of the trees, which he says are some 40 to 60 kilometers high. We may have had faculties that correspond with that kind of size and capability. We obviously had a lot more strength. We would have required a lot more oxygen. And in the absence of oxygen, perhaps we miniaturized, because smaller forms of our old selves would require less oxygen. So there may have been a really huge event that sucked up the oxygen on the planet. It immediately, instead of allowing the life forms to decompose as they normally would in an oxygen and water-rich environment. Remember, if there was a big exothermic reaction, exothermic properties are, they create heat and they take up water and oxygen. So whatever might have happened, it might have been a single event, it might have been a series of events, but it deprived the planet of its oxygen, or the world of its oxygen, and of its water. So immediately, decomposition could not occur in its normal phases. And I can go into that, but I don't want to hog this interview.
To dovetail on that, it's something I mentioned before we got the call started. One of the thoughts that I had was these giant trees, you mentioned 60 kilometers, which is 37 miles high, that if these trees were photosynthesizing, then the amount of oxygen that we would have on Earth, you would think that it would be extremely abundant, far more than what we have today, because the trees are much, much smaller today. So that's one thought that I had, was that maybe the depletion of oxygen is one of the reasons why everything kind of shrunk. Things kind of got smaller. Trees, us. And I'll get into this piece a little bit because I spoke to Priscilla Vogelbacher, who is a researcher into mythology. Mythology is replete with giants and megalithic structures and temples of the gods and all of that, which means that if we are to put some vested interest into mythology, that would say that there was a time on this earth when things were a lot bigger, a lot larger, a lot taller.
Sophia, you were mentioning that the trees were not silicon based, and they became, when the event happened, they became silicon, and that is because there was no oxygen and water. Is that what you're saying?
I'm suggesting that they crystallized in the absence of the normal conditions that create decomposition. And in order to understand decomposition, you have to understand the trophic chain a little bit. But the normal trophic chains of life could not be conducted because they didn't have the correct environment.
Do we have any experiments? I mean, is that an experiment that's repeatable? Take something like something and remove water and oxygen and have it crystallize? I just don't know.
I'm using my 2-cent layperson's thinking, but crystallization would be the passage of from one phase to another, one state to another, really, not phase. So hexagonal shapes are stable. He makes this case in the video, that hexagonal shapes are the most strong, stable shapes in nature. This is why the bee uses its malleable wax to make a honeycomb, because the honeycomb is very strong. Angles are generally strong shapes. The triangle is considered the most stable shape in the universe, but the triangle doesn't give you as much room as a hexagon. A hexagon is 2 triangles, right? A circle gives you the most room, but a circle isn't as rigid and stable as a hexagon or a triangle or some kind of geometric shape, because those angles give it strength. So my theory was, if you look at tubular morphogenesis, if you research the work of this Stanford biochemist Mark Krasnow, he is the one who started to look into how cells and living forms generate themselves, and everything generates through what's called tubular morphogenesis. So tubules are the root structure of biological life. And I'll use a tree as an example. A tree is a big tube, right? The trunk, what is that? It's a tube. The branches are other tubes. The stems of leaves that come off, the branches, and the smaller branches, they're all tubes. If you look at a leaf, what is it? It's a bunch of tubes, fibers. And within those fibers, you get the manufacturing of other materials. So everything in nature is tubular. Everything in biology is tubular. Cells empty their middles out. It's called cavitation, to create new forms and spaces for new things to be made. So as I looked at that, if a round shape has to solidify quickly, it's going to go to a hexagon. So that's where you get that jump into hexagonal crystallization, because something round was not given the conditions to decompose, and it had to pass from a semi-solid state into a very solid state. So it expressed as a hexagon. Silicon is not a life form. Silicon is a residue of a carbon life form because whatever conditions were imposed did not allow normal decomposition to occur. Let's just take ourselves into the world of the trees. If we had giant trees, 30, 40 miles high, those trees would give us massive canopies and shade, right?
Right.
And we might live in the trees. I don't know how big we were, but we might have used those trees as our homes, and they provided the oxygen for us to breathe, and we took up large amounts of oxygen ourselves. And then something that desired certain properties and qualities of this life came in to kill the trees, because the trees were if you look at the trophic chain, I'm just going to give a quick roundup of the trophic chain. The trophic chain, carbon-based biology, it exists in different parts of the world in a different way, but there's a marine chain that's trophic marine chain, or the marine trophic chain. Then there's a trophic chain in Siberia, trophic chain in Africa, in the jungle, trophic chain in the rainforest of Brazil, trophic chain in India. So you start always with the plant life. The plant life, they are called the producers. So the trees would have been the producers, because producers don't go out and hunt their food. They actually know how to make their food, and they make it from sunlight. They convert sunlight into food. That's what plants do. Chlorophyll is their food, and they make it out of sunlight. So above the producers on the trophic chain, which is an ecological chain of organisms, you have consumers. And we'll start with little consumers that eat plants. Then sometimes you have bigger consumers that are thoroughly plant eating. For instance, the big whales. There are lots of huge whales that are krill feeders. They eat plants, and they eat small animals that eat plants. So anyway, all the way up the chain, you have consumers upon consumers upon consumers, bigger and more complex life forms that eat smaller and less complex life forms. And you'll get up to the apex consumers. The apex consumers would be those organisms, animals in an area that have no predators. The timber wolf in the Dakotas, the Bengal tiger in India, the lion in Africa, the white shark, the great white shark in the ocean, right? So these are the biggest forms of life, and some of the toothed whales in the ocean also. And you end up with those animals dying themselves, and then what descends on them to decompose, to consume them? It would be it's the top level and the least credited level of the trophic chain, and those are the decomposers. So the decomposers would be fungi, microbes, bacteria, and when a life form is finished and is just sitting there rotting, it's rotting because decomposers are invited to it to consume it, break it down, feed on it, to render it into nutrients that support the trophic chain from the bottom up all over again. And I'm saying that whatever event happened, I'm positing that it was by design, by an outside force that coveted certain earth properties, and it pushed this big event on us and took out the two things that we needed, the trees and the oxygen and the water. And boom, everything settled immediately into crystalline form because it didn't have the conditions that would have otherwise promoted and supported the normal decomposition.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about, you said some event was forced upon us. Something intentional took place to take all of this out. Now, in the video, and you guys keep me honest here, I thought he said it was in 1816, which would make it 200 years ago. Some event took place. And I had a hard time grabbing onto that, to be honest with you, because the first thing that came to my mind was, I've seen lots of pictures from the 1800s, and Didn't look like everything was flattened. He does call our attention to the war photographs of Roger Fenton, which he took back in 1855, and that was the war in Crimea. And if you go online, and I'll put some of these pictures in a slideshow, at least where Roger Fenton took the pictures, it looks like a wasteland. And it looks barren, it looks like a quarry, and there is nothing there. And I looked at all those pictures, and I was looking for trees, any size tree. If it was 2 feet high, I was looking for a tree. And in all those pictures, I saw maybe a handful, and they were very, very small. But the entire landscape of the pictures that Roger Fenton took, it was barren. So I don't know if the gentleman that put the video together was using the Roger Fenton pictures from the Crimean War as a way to illustrate what the land looked like about 200 years ago. But again, the reason why I have some of a problem with that is because, okay, so those are pictures of Crimea in Russia, but I've seen plenty of pictures where that landscape didn't exist here in North America, and other pictures from around the world, especially when photography first came into play. So what are your thoughts on that, as far as the timeline, or you just don't know, or I don't know. I'm struggling with it. I'm having a hard time with an event that took place 200 years ago.
I'm not sure he said that this happened 200 years ago. To me, that doesn't make sense. I would think it would have had to happen much, much longer ago for there to be no sign of it. You know, I don't know when you want to get into it, but you know, a lot of the questions that are being asked is where did the material go? What was it used for?
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of unanswered questions, Mike.
Okay. All right. So maybe I'm wrong with the date. I mean, that's what I took from it. But I will point people, I'll put a link in the show notes to those Roger Fenton pictures because they really are eye-openers. Maybe we should talk a little bit about the hexagonal shapes of these trees because I think that that's very important. Mainstream science wants us to believe that these hexagonal shapes came about because lava had solidified. David, you sent one video over today. I took a look at it where there was a guy trying to convince us that lava can form into a hexagonal shape, but I wasn't very convinced from that video. So is there anything you guys want to say about the hexagonal shapes, about its occurrence in nature and so on? Anything you want to add?
I'll just throw something out. First of all, I want to go back to what you said about his example of the Crimean War. I think he was just saying that this created a wasteland, and similarly, something could have created a wasteland here as well at another time. But there's no, I don't think he's trying to say that prior to the 1800s we had giant trees.
Okay.
I think he's just saying that he kind of posited in his video that there was some kind of nuclear event, but then he retracted that later, I heard, from comments on YouTube and so forth. But here's what I want to throw in, and I'm going to throw it in the middle of the show because I want people to be encouraged. The fact that in my theory, and remember, I could be an idiot, it's just fine, I don't care, you can think whatever you want, that we miniaturized is an adaptive biology. Biology always adapts. If the wind blows on a tree, it's going to lean. If it has to fall over, it'll fall over, but it's going to bend to and with the wind. Because biology, the impetus in biology is always toward reproduction. Whatever biological form it is, it wants to survive so that it can reproduce and create more of itself. So whatever is happening, whether it's a white shark, or it's a tree, or it's an ant, it wants to survive the conditions that it meets such that it can reproduce. And so I think that our miniaturization was an expression, a rebounding, that said, haha, we don't have to be big, we can be small. Try taking us out while we're small. If you look at ant colonies, if you've ever had an ant invasion in your house, you'd get rid of a bunch of them. I just wet them down with my natural countertop spray if I have to. But you're not going to stop all the ants. You don't know where the colony is. These things are, the smaller the organism, the more resilient it is, right? So in our miniaturization, we simply became more resilient. We said, hey, you took us out when we were big. Here we are. Now we're small. Now we need less of everything. And the trees even miniaturized. And that, I think, is quite fantastic. And to me, it speaks to our ability to rebound. They can't take us out because we're always going to find a way to rebound. This was the encouragement I got from this video on a psychic, spiritual level.
That's a very positive aspect of it, Sofia, and I don't think it's a wild thought at all. If we go back to what you said earlier about the oxygen levels being reduced and so on, that would mean that all life would have to adapt. They would have to do something in order to survive. So miniaturizing or shrinking down, however you want to define it or say it, I think that that's something that's we could put on the table.
And let me throw this in as well. So I'm going to use John Lash's term, the demiurge and its cohorts. Right, Mike?
Yes.
You understand that?
Yes.
The demiurge and its cohorts came in to take our homes, which would have been the trees, and our oxygen. This was the big fire that killed the producer trees. The trees were the producers. We lost our homes and our oxygen, but we survived by miniaturizing along with the trees themselves. So everything miniaturized so we could survive on a lot less oxygen. So then it occurred to me, well, if we miniaturize, we may also have diversified, meaning that the animals and the insects and the birds, they all originated from our form, which is why we share so much DNA with so many other life forms. Because that has always puzzled me. How come we share upwards of 90% of our DNA with life forms that are nothing like us? So is it possible, just throwing it out there, is it possible that not only did we miniaturize, but we created all these life forms out of ourselves?
Sophia, wouldn't that be considered evolution? You know, that one creature turning into another creature?
No, I'm saying these are properties that some would call magic. We threw our DNA out there, and there were enough small variations in it that they created. Okay, so you know how they say God made us in his image? John Lash's book is not in his image, right?
Right.
What if every creature that came out on this earth, it's just a theory, call me an idiot, but I am playing with ideas, came out of us. It's not that they started before us, that's evolution. They came out of us. So the life on this plain planet world Earth is now extremely varied, and it clearly has the capacity to reinvent itself over and over and over, completely anew. It can adapt, it can survive. And it's that quality, that capacity that has been observed and that is greatly desired by somebody. So now let's go to the silicon dioxide. He says that we're being quarried. And I'm sorry if I'm just taking by the horns your outline.
No, go ahead, continue.
All right, so if we're being quarried, he claims in his video that, and I'm just using his video as a springboard, which I'm sure he would agree it is, that the quarrying is being done of limestone. That limestone is calcium carbonate, CaCO3. So limestone, what do they use limestone for? If you study the Manhattan Project, they use limestone for explosives, so it supports war and destruction. And they use limestones for fertilization of organic life. Fertilizer, lime, that's the most widely used form of fertilizer, and it's derived from limestone. So limestone has two very important uses. It spurs organic growth, and it supports destruction of organic and other materials, right? So somebody wants this. Is that why we're being quarried?
That we're being quarried for the limestone. Is that your point?
Yeah. Limestone. Okay, so then you look at the three kinds of rock. I remember from high school, we have igneous, sedimentary, and metamorphic rock. And as I remember, the igneous is the hardest. It's the really, like, you can't drill into this. Granite and all that is igneous rock. Then you have sedimentary rock, which is the most powdery. Limestone would be sedimentary rock. And then you have metamorphic rock, which is flinty. It flakes. Shale. Those are the rocks that when you hit them, they break into layers. That's the metamorphic rock. And you know what, Mike? Now I'm thinking all of geology is just baloney. But I know those three categories because you can actually observe them with your own eyes and your own hands and your own experiments. So that much seems to be correct.
Yeah, well, and I'll let David jump in here in a moment. But, you know, when you just said that all geology is baloney, you know, when I was watching that video and he was showing the quarry, which we call the Grand Canyon, you know, once he pointed it out, you know, you do have to wonder. You have to say to yourself, where are the geologists? Where are the free thinkers? Where are the critical thinkers? Because, you know, and look, I mean, we're all guilty of it too, but the thing is, I didn't major in geology. So you would think that if you're standing someplace and it's a quarry, you would call it a quarry and not call it something else. So, and that's what we have going on around the world. So,
yeah, some things are just so unthinkable on a scale that, you know, we were taught that there was never anything big, you know, that we live on a spinning ball, that these small creatures are, you know, and you would look at the Grand Canyon and never see it until something like this points it out. The Grand Canyon, that's pretty clearly quarried out to me. My question is, are the oceans quarried out? Was the Earth truly flat, and all of our hills and mountains and oceans, and, you know, some of them are flooded quarries, as he says, and some of them are just empty quarries? Are they? You know, is the mid-Atlantic ridge really volcanic? You know, is that the waste pile in the middle of the quarry? I don't know. You know, the mid-Atlantic ridge, we're told, is this volcanic ridge line that goes down the center of the ocean that's pushing the continents apart. Well, we know that's not true at this point. So is there even a mid-Atlantic ridge? Is it, you know, wouldn't we see, you know, on ships that are crossing the ocean, you know, bubbles coming up from burning lava below? You know, I went across the ocean very close to the water. I windsurfed across the ocean in 1998, and I didn't see any bubbles at any point.
I was thinking as I was watching it that the entire configuration of the Earth was very different, very, very different at one time, because if they were doing this quarrying and it was pervasive and it was everywhere, then land was filled in by water, water was filled in by waste that they were pushing into piles someplace. So I think that, you know, what we see today as the Earth with the land masses, North America, South America, Europe, Africa, and so on, it could very well have been very, very different. Let's talk a little bit about the, we don't have to spend a lot of time on this, but I do think it's important. We started on it and then we kind of diverted a little bit. But the hexagonal shape, I don't think that we should take this too lightly. Mainstream science wants to say, as I mentioned before, that this is just lava that has solidified. I did some research today, and the way they came about determining and deciding that it was lava that solidified was there was an article back in December of 2008, December 25th, the University of Toronto, and it says that physicists have cracked the mystery behind the strange and well-ordered hexagonal columns found at such popular tourist sites as Northern Ireland's Giant's Causeway and California's Devil's Tower, using water, cornstarch, and a heat lamp. And using a combination of field observation, experiments, and mathematical theory, they have solved the problem of what decides the size of the columns. Now, I'm not trying to be, you know, flip about this, but that just sounds like a bunch of pseudoscience to me. I don't know, David, what do you think?
I was going to ask if NASA did the experiment. You know, I don't understand. Maybe Sofia has some thoughts on it. But, you know, if lava's coming up and somehow forming into nearly perfect hexagonal tubes, what makes it perfectly level or fairly level at the top? What smoothed it off?
Right.
If mountains are what we're told they are, wouldn't they all be smooth from wind and rain? They'd be, instead of jagged. I have a difficult time with, mountains being tree stumps, but I also have a difficult time with mountains being what they tell us they are.
Well, now the other thing about the hexagonal shape, just to add on to what I said before, it's not something that it's just happenstance in nature. So we have the eyes of a fly, hexagonal, honeycombs, soap bubbles, snowflakes, organic molecules, quartz crystals. And then, Sophia, they talk about the columns, how do we say this? The basalt or basalt columns. Did I pronounce that right?
Right. Basalt
Okay.
in America, basalt in England.
Okay, basalt. So they made sure that in the articles that I found on the internet to look this up, that they put that in there. Although what they're really talking about there, I believe, is the lava.
Well, Mike, I'm going to tell you my thinking process a week or so ago as I was taking a walk. And again, this is a layperson's thinking. If you think of water droplets that are raindrops, and as raindrops fall and they pass through very cold air, they will start to head towards solid form, right? Because water as a gas is steam. Water vapor is the gaseous form of H2O. And the solid form of H2O is ice, and the liquid form is water, as we know it. And water happens to be the only thing on this planet that exists all over as in all three forms at the same time. So a snowflake, to me, is an interphasic, interstage between liquid turning to solid. And look at snowflakes. They're all hexagons, and no two are alike. But they're not expressing as hexagons in outline form. The condensation nucleus of a raindrop, because that's what a raindrop has at its core. A raindrop has a piece of dust or particulate, salt sometimes, that attracts, it has an affinity for moisture, and it creates a little bead of moisture around it. And then as it becomes bigger and bigger, it becomes more and more unstable and wants to fall to the earth as a raindrop. So if it falls through cold air, it's going to start icifying, but if it doesn't make it into ice, that would be hail, it ends up as a snowflake. So the snowflake is expressing, it's looking for stability as it drops, as it moves its stage or phase. And it's expressing, this is my own terminology, not through its outline as a hexagon, but through its inlines, right? So if lava is a liquid, and lava has to harden right away, or something has to harden right away, it's going to pick hexagonal shape, because snowflakes do. So I don't know whether lava is real or not real, but liquids, to me, in this instance of snowflakes, which occur all over the earth all the time, they're choosing the hexagonal shape for utmost stability.
Now, do you think the lava did that?
I don't know. I'm just saying liquids would tend to, if they had to solidify quickly, it's all about, have you ever heard of superheating and supercooling?
Yes.
Okay, so these are ways to shift a material from one phase to another without going through the intermediary phase. So superheating would be heating a solid such that it skipped the liquid phase and it went straight to a gas. Supercooling is the other way. You take a gas, you cool it down, and it goes into solid form. It skips liquid. And a snowflake is kind of like that because it's a very quick passage through cold air and it starts to crystallize and it is going into hexagonal shape. It's telling you, I want to be a hexagon. So something about hexagons is germane to organic materials. And many materials on this earth, they like to be crystals in hexagonal form. I can't tell you any more than that because I'm just thinking in my own way, and I'm not a chemist and I'm not a physicist or anything like that.
We're just brainstorming, so we don't have to qualify anything that we say. We're just putting ideas out there and we're just talking through this. That's all this is. So David, what were you going to say?
Did I hear you say that lava possibly can form into hexagonal shapes?
I'm simply saying liquids, if they're hurried fast into solid state, they may express as hexagons. That's all I'm saying. Because that's what water appears to do when it descends and becomes snow.
Okay, I mean, that's fair enough. I don't know if I would agree with that with regard to the lava. I mean, and I say that because I've taken a look at all these pictures of lava, and I've taken a look at the Giant's Causeway in particular, and the design and the stacking of the hexagon strands, if you will, the piping is so precise. It appears to me to be a design that is of intelligent design, that it was put together that way, that it wasn't because of what mainstream science wants to say, right, that it was lava from volcanic activity. But that's my thoughts on it, that I have a hard time believing that those hexagonal strands or piping on those trees are lava.
Before David talks, just let me take you in this direction. You said exactly the right thing. So what are organic forms? They're largely water, right? Your body is something like 75 to 90 something % water. So if organic forms are hurried out of their pliable state, which would be containing a lot of water, if something happens such that they're not allowed to decompose and they're pushed and rushed, they may solidify and they may express as hexagons. That's what I'm saying.
Okay.
Just like snowflakes do.
David.
Yeah, no, I'm with you there, and I agree. I don't have an excuse or an explanation that says that lava can become those tubes, especially the ones that are hanging from the ground, coming down and just stop. The level tops, the uniformity to it. There's just a lot pointing towards it was something living.
A design, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess what we'll do is we'll leave that there. I mean, I don't know if there's any more we can do with that one. We'll just have to do some more research into it. Let me ask this question. Now, in the video, he shows these gigantic machines, which he says are the machines that are used to quarry. And I thought he was alluding to the fact that these were the machines that were used to also take the trees down, the big trees. And I struggled with that because I was looking at the size of those machines that he was saying. Did I get it wrong?
Yeah, I think so. He was saying here are the giant machines that we have today.
Okay.
They could be similar to on a much smaller scale to what was used back then. I mean, we don't know, they could have had technology if these were cut down, that weren't that were using, lasers. I don't know. It could be anything. It's hard to imagine a saw blade that can make one of those mesas in one fell swoop.
Well, and the thing that got me was whatever took the trees down. I mean, can you imagine when those trees fell, what that was like?
Did they cut them down from the bottom up, or did they cut them from the top down, like guys that cut trees here that are in between houses, And if these trees are so big, maybe they were really spaced out. The big question is, where did all the material go, and what was it used for?
Yeah, we'll get into that because that's something I want to talk about. There's a lot of people that are asking that question. Now, just to reiterate, we mentioned it earlier in the show, the size of the trees, 60 kilometers. Is that what he had said?
Yes.
Did I get that right? Okay, so 60 kilometers is 37 miles high.
It's pretty big.
That's pretty big, okay? It's interesting. I was driving down the road the other day after watching this documentary, and I'm looking at all the trees as I'm driving on the highway in North Carolina, because I live in North Carolina in the Raleigh area. And I'm thinking to myself, well, I'll be. I'm looking at these trees and I don't really see a tree that's more than 100 feet in the air. So that was just something I want to throw out there as people are driving your car and you're looking around. Take a look at the trees. I mean, they're not, I mean, to us, they might be big. We might go into a state park or a forest and look up and think, wow, it's 100 feet in the air.
And how old are those trees? 100-foot trees, how old?
It depends upon the tree, I guess. You know, certain trees grow at different rates based upon what type of tree it is. But I don't know. 100 years, 200 years, I don't know.
We look at most of these forests, and they have trees about the same size, you know, the canopy. So what happened before that? Were there no trees? You know, did something wipe them out and start over again?
Right. Because my point being is, and you guys are getting it, is the trees are pretty much all the same height.
That's what I'm saying.
It's kind of weird, right? They all grew up at the same time. They all came into play. Like, I guess the pine trees would be a good example because we have tons and tons of pine trees here in North Carolina. And you're driving, like I said, down 40. All the pine trees are the same height, give or take, 5, 10 feet, 15 feet maybe, So, I mean, just food for thought. Just put that out there.
Well, there's an expiration program. I mean, all of biology has programs written into it. So why are all humans? It's like saying, okay, human beings, they grow to whatever now, between 5'5" and 6'5", most of them. How come they don't grow any taller?
Yeah.
But that's another possibility of the adaptation. So the trees only grow to a certain height because they know that that's where they have to stop and the life cycle has to begin again because it's a shorter life cycle, right?
Okay, good point. So you're saying naturally they know that there's a limit.
Right, because there's not enough oxygen to support that.
Okay.
And we also have, I mean, I don't know about the quality of the atmosphere at that time when there were the large trees, but there's a density issue. And, when you fly in a plane and you're, 35, 40,000 feet in the air, 38,000 they usually go, it's cold up there. And that's because there's less solid material to conduct heat. So when you said that the trees were very high and they were closer to the sun, you would have to set some kind of, accepted distance of the sun. It's not, we don't think it's 93 million miles anymore, right?
Right.
It also has to do with the solidity, the density of the medium. And air at that height is less dense than it is close to the Earth, where it contains a lot of water vapor and particulate and, all kinds of other materials, smog,
As we said at the beginning, perhaps the atmosphere was much denser, super thick down here. And, at 10, 20, 30, 40 miles up, it could be like it is here right now. It's very, very possible if there were trees that big.
Yeah. Yeah, we don't know.
One thing, Mike, which I like to touch on, I don't think it's in your notes. A lot of people are saying trees that big would suck up all of the water, and they could not. There would not be enough water, and that's because most people are not familiar with primary water, which is what Gaddafi discovered. And if you just check out primarywater.org, they got it right, except the shape of the world that they're in. They're assuming it's a ball, but if you put that on a flat plane, there's plenty of water. There's plenty of water then, and there's plenty of water now. But people are not aware that there's oceans of water below the surface of the Earth. That's why we're not allowed to dig wells over 300 feet, because if we do, we'll tap into primary water, right, and they won't be able to control us with the water like they do now.
All trees, Mike, had to have giant root systems that used the primary water supply, the self-replenishing water deep in the earth. And it's very possible that we too, as larger beings with greater faculties, I'm always going to throw that in, we have agreed on some evolutionary level, adaptive level, to lose certain faculties, which could be our faculties toward creation, magic, the super stuff that we were once able to do, divination, ESP, communication without language. I mean, what we're doing now is just it's a residual form of who we used to be. So we too were dependent on the primary water cycle. And that was all taken away And we then regenerated as miniatures, and we figured out how to subsist on the rain and evaporation cycle, the secondary water cycle, because that's an adaptive measure as well.
Well, this would go a long way to explaining, Sophia, your theory as to why it is that they have a difficult time trying to depopulate and take us out. Because your premise says that we are extremely adaptive and extremely resilient.
Well, I've now taken this to heart a little more.
Yeah.
This video made me realize, well, if we manage to rebound as miniatures of what we once were, existing on the secondary water cycle instead of the primary water cycle, then, hey, maybe we're not so forsaken and we don't need to feel so despondent, because we have abilities, built-in biological abilities, that allow us to regenerate and start again.
Let me just go back 1 second, going back to how they took the trees down. Back in 1908, there was the Tunguska event, which took place in Russia. And there was a something, and they don't really know what it is or what it was, came in from the sky, and it was an airburst. And they said it was about 3 to 6 miles above the Earth. And it was the equivalent to 10 to 15 megatons of TNT. It was a monstrosity of an explosion, and it wiped out in Tunguska, Russia, which is in Siberia, over 770 square acres, flattened it. Now, mainstream science has conjectured that it was a meteor. However, there are others in alternative research who claim that this was Tesla technology, that it was Tesla's direct energy technology, or what we would probably call today a direct energy weapon. The reason why I wanted to bring it up is because there's also I think, a mindset that says that the advent of the types of weaponry that we have today really didn't come about until, the late 1940s with the atomic bomb. But in reality, there were scientists like Tesla who were working on technologies that, Tesla wasn't looking to create or invent technology that was going to hurt humanity. He wanted to help humanity. But of course, the powers that be would take that technology and they would use it for other purposes. And so it's quite possible that that Tunguska event is gives us some insight, if you will, into what could have happened if there were giant trees on Earth at one time. That if the technology that people think didn't exist in 1908 did exist, then it's quite possible that technology that people don't believe existed back whenever did exist too. So I just want to throw that out there. Any thoughts?
I think it was definitely some technology test. You notice how all the big meteors that come into Earth always hit in Russia or some unpopulated area. By chance, one would have to hit a city by now, but they always go off in places where very few people are, or some people are. It could be the one a couple years ago, or recently, that broke a bunch of windows. It could just be some sort of concussion bomb that they drop from a balloon or from a high flying aircraft and shoot it in. And tell everybody, be afraid of meteors.
Or a direct energy weapon, because
of course,
right? Because what they mentioned, I read the reports going back to 1908. They interviewed people, and they said there was a huge fireball going through the sky. And so, what do we see today? We see these fireballs going through the sky. The one in Russia, I guess, a few years ago.
Yep.
Right now in Tunguska, just to stick on it for a second, there was no crater. There was nothing. Okay. So afterwards, when they got there, they took a look. I mean, they were expecting to see a monstrosity of a crater sitting in the ground. There was nothing but flattened trees for 770 square acres. So anyway, I'm with you on that, David. I think that
770 square acres, 7. They love their sevens.
So, well, at least it's not 777.
Right.
Okay, so let's get to I know what David's chomping at the bit here. The video claims that Earth is a huge quarry. And one of the questions I guess I had was, well, what was being quarried and for what purposes? So it could have been many types of things that they were quarrying for, right? That they were mining for.
Yeah,
Any thoughts on that?
I'll go real quick and then let Sophia jump in. My new understanding of how our Earth is, it's no secret that I believe that the Earth is flat, not a spinning ball flying through infinite space, and that there is hidden land. There's some new work coming out on actually creating a map of how the continents are laid out, and it appears that Antarctica only surrounds the bottom. When looking at the map from the orientation that we normally look at it from, the bottom sides. And the top half, if you're looking at the map, could just be an ocean corridor to more land, hidden land. And the reason that we are trapped here and we can't see it is because they've created the GPS to navigate us. So when you go what should be north or straight up, it curves you around to the side by following those coordinates. And the only way to go to find that ocean corridor is to use a gyroscopic device that will stay rigid in space and take you in that direction. Once you understand that we live on I'll call it an infinite flat plane, there could be, so much more land, and perhaps we are just working in the quarry to, be exploited to this very day, where the resources that we are digging out of the earth are being taken by the elite and their bosses and whoever is above them to more hidden land that we are not aware of.
Well, there was an article going back to 1907, and I think I sent this to you guys, and I'll put this in the slideshow and the show notes. The Hawaiian Gazette, January 11th, 1907, and they had published in a newspaper a 1,000-year-old map that was found. I believe it was of Japanese origins.
Yep.
And that map clearly shows more land beyond Antarctica, and it's a lot more land. And so for the folks that are listening to the show, I will put this in the show notes, and I will put it into the I'll put it into the slideshow so you can take a look at it. And I mean, people can call this a bunch of nonsense and all that stuff, and it's deception and so on. But you know what? I mean, it gets to a point where you really have to stop just discarding things, and you have to take a look at them, and you have to start piecing the puzzle together, and you have to start connecting the dots on this. I don't know. I tend to believe that back in 1907 there was a lot more freedom and innocence and integrity in reporting than we do today, clearly. And there's a lot of stuff that got into newspapers back in those days, like giants, as an example. There were giant skeletons found in the United States and elsewhere, and articles were written about this, but we won't see that stuff today. So in any case,
and real quick, Admiral Byrd, if you believe the Admiral Byrd story, he went supposedly into Antarctica and said he came across a vast untouched land, bigger than the United States, much bigger. And I'm not, my idea of extra land isn't bigger than the United States. It's bigger than everything we know, more and more and more. And there, as far as we know, there could be another sun and moon orbiting above that, and it could go on and on. I was, when I first discovered the true nature of the world we live in, I said a good possibility is what I call puddle theory. And I imagine these puddles separated by 10, 20, 50, 100,000 miles. I think they're all connected, and that we are just kept, to this puddle by whether it's evil forces or good forces until we're ready to understand and expand out. That's up for debate. But there is definitely, in my opinion, more land out there, and a lot more.
Yeah, and like I said, David, when I show folks this map, this will validate exactly what you're saying. There is a lot more land if this map is true. Now, what I wanted to do is to jump in to the mythology aspect of this, and let me just set this up for the audience. What I wanted to do was to see what connections we had back to mythology with regard to giant trees. And so I had a conversation with Priscilla Vogelbacher, and I will tack on that discussion I had with Priscilla to the end of this show so you can listen to it. Now, Priscilla is an expert in mythology and in comparative religions. And so what I did was I sent her a link to the video, and I didn't tell her anything about the video other than, could you tell me, based upon your expertise in mythology, if there are any connections? Now, I'm not an expert in mythology. I know a little bit, enough to be dangerous, but, I'm not an expert. So she got back to me after about a week. And I'll just read a couple of bullets here, and then we can talk about it. But she had said that, she assessed the video, and she did it objectively. So she has no position, by the way, on the giant tree theory. She didn't rave about it. She just got right into the mythology aspects of it with me when we talked about it. She said to me that trees play a very prominent role in mythology. So she said if, and that's if with an underline, if the video is true about giant trees, then the concept of the world tree needs to be taken literally. And the world tree that she pointed me to, there are many in mythology, but the most prominent is from Norse mythology. That tree, it's pronounced the Yggdrasil, but it's spelled Yggdrasil, but pronounced Ig, the Y is an I, Yggdrasil, was the tallest tree on earth. And the world tree is a motif present in several religions and mythologies, particularly Indo-European religions, Siberian religions, and Native American religions. The world tree is represented as a colossal tree which supports the heavens, thereby connecting the heavens, the terrestrial world, and through its roots, the underworld. It may also be strongly connected to the motif of the tree of life from the Bible. So she spent a lot of time focusing on the Norse mythology, and Yggdrasil, that's the colossal tree, the world tree in Norse mythology. And it was an immense ash tree that is central and considered very holy. She said, obviously, in the Garden of Eden, we had the tree of life. We also had the tree of knowledge of good and evil. She said that trees have a strong connection to enlightenment and creation, that in mythology, trees bring salvation. Trees are known as the book of life. And language, she said, began with trees. And I will tack on my conversation with Priscilla so you can get more of an understanding of that. I'm not going to do it justice. We'd have to get Priscilla on the show to really talk about it. Now, I asked her about the Garden of Eden because I did an interview with Priscilla, and in that interview, and it was before the giant tree video had come out, she said to me that the Garden of Eden was an artificial structure or greenhouse for the gods. And outside the garden, it was desolate and a wasteland. So when I watched the giant tree video, my interview, my conversation with Priscilla, it ran through my head. So we're talking about a quarry, we're talking about a wasteland, and then we're talking about giant trees. She says that in mythology, the wasteland or the desolation outside of the Garden of Eden was due to Mount Toba and the eruption of Mount Toba. And that eruption took place about 75,000 years ago, and it's one of Earth's largest known eruptions. And it was catastrophic. And let me just see, it said here it caused a global volcanic winter of 6 to 10 years and possibly a 1,000-year-long cooling episode. So I just wanted to put that out there. A lot of folks, they think that mythology is fiction, and I think that that's another deception by the powers that be, that they want you to believe that mythology is fiction. I tend to believe that there's a whole lot of truth in mythology, and there's a lot of stuff that's being hidden from us, and especially what that mythology taught. We're not taught that anymore, and in fact, we're not really taught mythology anymore. The only way you get to learn that is you take it under your belt and you do it yourself. You're not going to get that in school. In any case, that's some of the input from Priscilla, and she said that everything on Earth was much larger and much more grandiose. She talked about the quarries also. She said in Mesopotamia mythology, the quarries were underwater. So I found that very interesting. But she said the best example of a giant tree, the world tree, would be Norse mythology. And she recommended that folks, if they were interested, to research that. Any thoughts?
It's very interesting, Mike. You know, I'm so glad you said that people think mythology is fiction, because it isn't. It precedes us, our modern times, our, split, the whole Descartes paradigm. We look to all this physics for everything. And I've heard from people who are extremely adventurous in terms of science that everything that we study, our physics, our astronomy, for instance, even our math, is such a limited field.
Yeah.
And it's on that basis, it's wrong.
I loved math in school, geometry, trigonometry, calculus. I excelled in it. And then after, years after I graduated college, I discovered sacred geometry and the Fibonacci sequence and all of this stuff that they never, ever even mentioned in school. They never taught us about the 5 Platonic solids in school. And that's the real math. They taught us fake limited math to keep us in a box.
Yeah. And hey, I just want to make one more comment here. She also mentioned that her research indicates that the gods are subterranean. Okay, so subterranean dwelling. This is a point that I brought up in other shows, where the reason why they want us to look up into the cosmos and to focus on space and planets and all that stuff is because they don't want us looking down. They don't want us to understand what's right below our feet. So she had mentioned that. She also mentioned that the quarry structure could be linked to ancient megalithic structures. And this is a guess on her part. She was surmising. She said, perhaps, Mike, they were quarrying earth to build the temples of the gods. And she says, in mythology, the temples dwarfed anything we know today. And this is where she said that everything was much larger and grandiose in mythology. So I just want to make sure I got that in there. I almost forgot to get those points in.
If we do live on an infinite flat plane and things were much bigger, as you're explaining here, you'd need a mighty large quarry to get material out of.
Right. So I think, to answer the question, David, that everybody's asking, and Sophia, where did the quarried material go? I believe that it went outside of our containment area, if you will, because we do live in a containment area.
I want to point out, I've been meaning to say it, in his video, there's a bunch of stuff that we all don't agree with. Like not every mountain, is a tree. Not every hole in the ground is a quarry. Would you agree with that?
I agree with that. I had a hard time believing everything was a tree. Now, I could be wrong, right? But I had a hard time grabbing onto that. I mean, I saw things that look like trees to me, okay? And even when he showed the mountain ranges and where a tree was cracked off, I'm like, okay. I've seen that plenty of times. I live in North Carolina. There's a lot of work that I do with trees that fall down during storms, so I get it. But everything, I had a hard time with that.
And he said that there were no rocks on Earth. Sophia, what is your thought on that? There's all different types of, like I grew up in the woods near my home, and there's, big rocks in the ground. It was a very rocky place. What are those rocks?
Well, rocks are minerals, right? Different mineralizations and hard forms of different compounds. And I honestly don't know what rocks are. I tried to do a little research and it just bewildered me. But he was saying that what they're quarrying out, at one point he said it's the entire Mendeleev periodic table. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
They're taking all the elements. And so I have to ask myself, well, how did those elements form? And they keep finding new elements with strange names. But I don't know. I don't know enough about this. And I can't comment intelligently on what rocks really are, other than very dense forms of matter that may be considered inorganic now, but at one time were organic. Remember, this is all about density also. And when we start getting into density, we're going to touch on this whole dimensionality. We live in the three-dimensional environment in which the densest things are, for instance, rocks and certain kinds of, I don't know what else, that form very intense concentrations and solids. And the lightest things they tell us are gas, and it all has to do with atomic mass and the way that things bond and float around. But there are other forms of lightness. We don't really know. You can cross into other dimensions and get lightness and solidity, right? So how do we know? We're just, as you say, we're in this very circumscribed, very contained existence that is reinforced through our very limited, very boring schooling.
Yeah, we don't know anything really when you think about it, right?
Yeah, we don't. I mean, it's almost like you have to start again. I would really like to take a baby and not teach it anything and just see what it discovers.
That's a good one. That would be good.
You're the smartest person on earth.
Considering everything we're taught is literally a lie, you know. I mean, you made the comment before that humans' life is very resilient. You know, it's tough to kill us.
Right.
You know, amazing things happen and people survive, except, you know, in these mass shootings, everybody dies instantly. You know.
Just sneak it in there, David.
Yeah. Got to do it. Got to do it.
Well, look, we have two more questions. I know it's getting late here on the East Coast for David and I, and but I promise these are the last two questions. So we've talked about this, and like I said, we're just putting our ideas out there, our thoughts, our reactions to this, applying some of the research we've done over the last 2 weeks. 2 weeks is not a lot of time to do a lot of research, but I thought it was important, and you guys did too, to talk about this because that video really resonated. A lot of people watched it, and a lot of people, their eyes opened up. And I've shown people the video. They watched it, and they watched the entire hour and 20 minutes with their eyes bulging out of their head like, you got to be kidding me. That looks like a tree, So here's the question. Why is it important? Okay, so we've got this video out there. It appears that there were colossal trees on Earth at one time. They're not here anymore. We have much smaller trees. Life goes on. So I guess it's the same question that people were asking about the flat Earth. I don't know if it's the same answer for this. So, David, why don't we start with you? I mean, why is this even important? Who cares?
It's such a good question. It's asked on every very important topic. We've been in prison. This is a prison planet. If you believe we live on a planet, your mind is in a prison. And we, I believe, I think you understand too, that we are great spiritual, powerful beings that have been we have given our power away by believing the lies. And if people knew the true nature of who we are, where we lived, that there isn't shortage, that there's infinite abundance, in my opinion, and that we can do great things beyond what we've been trained to believe. That's the most important thing on Earth. And the timing of this video just hitting everybody with the Flat Earth Awakening, you can be suspect of the timing, or it could be divinely inspired, to get this information out. If this came out a year and a half ago, I don't know what people would make of it, because it would be really hard to wrap your mind around it. It doesn't work on a spinning ball flying through space. And a year and a half ago, there was very few people that understood where we don't live, which is on a spinning ball. Just earlier in the show, when you said, the trees are 60 kilometers, 37 miles high, I just thought about that. I'm about 37 miles over the water to Manhattan. And on an infinite flat Earth, that's not that high if you flip that up in the air to me. I'm like, that is totally doable in a tree.
But think about it from the perspective of when people send those balloons up 20 miles up.
Yeah.
That tree is 17 miles beyond those balloons.
It makes perfect sense to me for
wild.
some. It's wild, but we live on a wild Earth. The fact that it resonates with people, how you have to trust your gut sometimes. You have to trust your that inner feeling that you have, and the feeling that so many people, including myself, are getting when we watch this video. There's something to it. Sometimes you don't believe something, but you have a feeling. That feeling is usually right. If you trust your feelings, you probably do better than trusting your mind.
Yeah.
Your logical mind that has been imprisoned with all of the stuff that we've been taught. His story is his story. It's all made up.
Sophia, why is this important? I mean, you touched on a very good point before, where the resiliency of life and humans. I mean, that's tremendous. Anything else?
Well, I put this video on my blog, and I want people to hear the Russian version. It's not in Russian, but it's a guy with a Russian accent, and he's so charming. He's so unique. It's difficult to understand, but it's worth listening to some of it and then switching over to Rhonda's version, which was done thanks to David, and she used his script, and it's much easier to understand. But for me, it was all about scale. When your concept of scale is overturned like this, then in a sense your mind is freed. And I think that's what's happening to people. They're experiencing a freeing of the mind because they're seeing before their own eyes a conversion of scale. And that's what we have to think about. I think subconsciously we take that right to ourselves and we start going into the mode of thinking that is the most creative, which is what if? What if? What if this is true?
Right.
The trees were this big. What if? And when you start thinking what if, then you're now on the path to creativity.
Right. See, that's a very good point, because a lot of people have been conditioned to believe that if you think that way, that you're out in la la land somewhere, that if you don't stay contained within the parameters of what science is teaching you and math and all that stuff, if you step out of the box and you use your imagination and you use your creativity, that somehow you're an oddball, that you're crazy, you're a tinfoil hat wearer, and so on. But you're absolutely right, Sophia. I mean, because the only way, in my view, that we're ever going to get out from under this mess is for people to use their imagination, to use their creativity, and to critically think. Hey, I just want to mention one thing, because some people will call this a psyop. I've already heard that. It's a psyop, it's a psyop, it's a psyop, right?
Oh, everything's a psyop.
What I try to explain to people is a psychological operation is not just lies. That psychological operations are put in play to also put out the truth. It's gotten a negative connotation over the years because that's how it's been used, especially with the government. Their psyops are negative. But a psychological operation can also be an operation in which truth is being pushed out. So I just want to make that comment out to the audience too. Look, I think that just quickly, my view on this, why it's important, is it's another nail in the coffin of the people that deceive. So anytime they're going to put their nonsense up on the History Channel or Nat Geo or Sci-Fi Channel, or they're going to put Neil deGrasse Tyson out there or Bill Nye, people are either going to tune out or they're going to listen with a very critical mind. And hopefully they'll ask a lot more questions. In the past, people didn't ask a lot of questions. They took whatever they said, hook, line, and sinker, and went home with it. And that's how we got into this mess, because people just believed authority. When you treat authority as truth versus truth as authority, that's how you dig yourself a gigantic hole. And we have to get ourselves dug out. Yeah, David.
Mike, knowing all that you know now, all of the things that we've discovered, the lies, and our minds have been opened up and we are actually thinking for ourselves. When you look back at what you were taught at school, isn't it shocking that we believed it and didn't question it? I mean, I was in science class, in astronomy class, and they're telling us all this stuff. I never questioned it because it was in the book. Right. And now that I look at that, I'm embarrassed that I just bought it hook, line, and sinker.
Yeah, but don't be embarrassed, because they play upon the fact that humans are trustworthy. When you're a kid going to school, you do not think that you're being lied to. And the teachers don't think they're lying. That's it. I mean, we have this whole hierarchy, right? It comes down, it's tops down. And
Yep.
you're sitting there, you're thinking, why would they lie to you? I mean, they're telling you the truth. And some people go their entire life that way. I mean, they're born and they're buried believing that. And there are those of us that have awakened, and now we realize that exactly what you just said. We sat in class and just got a bunch of lies shoveled down our throat. And hopefully more and more people, like I said now, are going to understand that and realize that and step off the hamster wheel and start to free think and critical think and start calling these people out for their lies and their deception. I mean, it's really unbelievable because I have to be honest with you. I'm digressing here. When I watched that video, the one thing I got a little angry. I felt anger building up in me because I thought to myself, we are really, really, like you said, David, on a prison planet. We are in a containment center. This is where you stay. You can't go any further. You can't explore. You can't discover. You stay right here. And the magnitude of the subversion and the magnitude of the lies that are in place to keep us here and the technology they have put in place to make sure that we stay here, it's absolutely mind-numbing. Okay, so look, I got the last question. I know because we're pushing up against 2 hours here. Now, this is a question I have heard. I have to honestly answer. Me personally, I don't know the answer to this, okay? So people have asked, okay, so what can be done to further research into this theory? Is there anything realistically that can be done? When I say realistically, I'm thinking in terms of, well, what are we supposed to do? Show up at Devil's Tower with, an archaeological dig with geologists? I mean, that's not going to happen. You're not going to be allowed to go there. The same way that alternative Egyptologists are not allowed to go to the pyramids in Giza. Sophia, what do you think comes after this? I mean, is there any other research that can get done, or is it basically this is it? How do you think this works?
Well, Mike, we need the help of people who have studied this a little more deeply than we have. I mean, we're coming from limited education. Where are the geologists? Where are the people who, even though, let's say, I just denounced geology a little while ago, but these are people who have a little more experience in this material. Organic and inorganic chemists, even physicists. So you and I can always use the pictorial record, just like we did with 9/11. Most of us weren't in New York, but there has been video and there were photographs taken, large numbers of photographs, and you can look at that visual record and you can start trying to analyze it and understand it, especially if you free your mind and you start thinking creatively. So we have all got access to pictures of these mesas, and we can go to tree stumps with pictures. And he does that in the video. He compares to garden variety tree stumps.
Yeah.
And why not? That's where we can start. But then the other thing is, let's prevail on people who are the educated and the credentialed among us, who are not all in the box thinker. Some of them aren't at all that. And they may decide to defect and start thinking open-mindedly themselves. And so we need to start banding together in that way to explore this a little more.
You're absolutely right. We need people to step out.
Yeah, and I was going to say something about mountain ranges, because I was thinking about, okay, if those mountains, like he at one point, and I'm never going to forget this, he says in the video, the tree Everest. The tree Everest. And then I started thinking, oh, all those people who climb Everest, they're not mountain climbers, they're climbing a tree stump. Isn't that wild? Yeah, I'm a tree climber. I'm really good.
Doesn't sound as impressive.
No, but some of these trees were so big. I mean, I don't know if you know, but the fact is that so many people in the Everest climbing craze, remember there was that craze right after John Krakauer wrote his book Into Thin Air?
Yeah.
Or during that time, everybody wanted to go on an Everest climbing expedition, and there were all these people who were totally not trained, and they would buy new boots, expensive climbing boots, and they'd put them on, and they'd get their Sherpas lined up, and they'd be guided up Everest, and they would die. They would die. There are corpses strung along Mount Everest that are just frozen in the ice and snow because there's no manpower to take them away and they don't decompose. These people were trying to climb the trees. And I wanted to just point out that in the mountain range context, I have seen trees in people's yards, these gigantic trees that you speak of as 100 feet tall. I don't know if the ones I've seen are that tall, but they actually come out of the ground as multiple trunks, right? Yes, so there's one root system, and the tree is it's this huge thing, almost like a bush, but it's giant. It has a giant canopy, and it has multiple trunks, effectively. So that could be the mountain ranges. They could be trees with multiple trunks right next to one another. And that, because otherwise I was thinking these big, huge trees with their giant canopies, they couldn't grow right next to each other. They need to have room for their roots and their canopies. The other thing I was thinking of, the assaults that we are being exposed to, from chemtrails to GMOs to vaccines, just all the stuff that's going on now that we're doubting we can even survive. The people who are perpetrating all this, let's call them, remember I talked about the trophic chain, and I said that at the very top of the chain were the microorganisms, the fungi and the molds and the bacteria and the microbes, and they would descend on the largest life forms and convert them into nutrients. So they're called the decomposers. Right. And so if we call the bad guys the decomposers, because their real plan is to take us down, take us apart, whether it's strategic in one way or another and it's an observation process, I don't really know. Their activity as decomposers would make us, are you ready? We're the composers. The trees are the producers, like I said, and we are the composers. And that gave me tremendous encouragement when I framed it that way for myself.
That's brilliant. I like being called a composer. And we shall call them the decomposers, because that's exactly who they are and what they are. I want to say this whole show was great. I know it was a lot of material, and I know that I probably didn't keep it together as well as I should have.
It's a tough one, where I've been left speechless thinking about this. It happened a couple of times during the show. This is another one that has really just blown me away. When I first started my truth seeking, it started all with 9/11, and I'm out on a limb, and everyone's saying that I'm crazy, and then I finally started getting acceptance there, and then Sandy Hook in Boston, and all these other things happened, and I'm like, oh my God, I got to do it again. And then I finally got enough people behind me and with me, and then all of a sudden this flat earth thing comes out, and I'm like, oh my God, I got to do it again, and everyone is screaming at me, and I had to hold my own. I'm like, okay, I've finally done it. What else could happen now we have giant trees. and there's a lot of people out there, even in the flat earth community, that are not buying it because it's too big, pun intended, for them to wrap their minds around. I'm not 100% yet, but I can't think of anything else that explains away the evidence that we see.
Yeah, I saw one video with some guy carrying on. He's in the flat earth movement, and he's going on and on about why we shouldn't be talking about giant trees. Stop already, stop. There's so many things that we could be researching, investigating, discovering, and exploring. Have at it. Take a look at things. So I know we're out of time, so Sofia, where can people find out more about your work?
My blog is Sofia Smallstorm, and you have to spell Sofia with an F.com, and I have podcasts that are accessible from that. That's actually my bigger website, but that particular URL takes you right to my blog, to the center of it. And then I have my products store. I share things that I've discovered that have helped me personally, and that's avatarproducts.com.
Excellent. David?
You could find links to all of my YouTube pages, Facebook pages at deepinsidetherabbithole.com. As we speak right now, my website is old school, doesn't work on iOS devices, but it is being redesigned and should be launched in the next week or two. Amazing new site that works on all platforms. So deepinsidetherabbithole.com. You could find my off-color podcast links there, my YouTube page, which is DITRH, stands for Deep Inside the Rabbit Hole. Everything's linked on the homepage there.
Excellent. Well, let me just say, you guys are awesome. It was a great conversation. I really love having both you guys on the show. And what we'll do is maybe we'll give it some time and maybe we'll reconvene on this topic. We'll certainly reconvene on other topics, that's for sure. But we'll see what happens with the giant trees in a couple of months. Sound good?
Sounds great.
Yes.
All righty. All right, you guys have a great evening, and I'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Mike.
And that concludes the conversation with Sofia and David. And as promised, here is my pre-show discussion with Priscilla Vogelbacher. Priscilla is an expert on mythology, and I asked her if she would offer her insights on the importance of trees in mythology. And here is what she had to say. Priscilla?
Hi.
Hey, how are you?
Hey, good. You?
Good, good. So, thank you for taking the time on this.
No problem.
Yeah, did you watch the documentary?
Yeah, I listened to all of it. Yeah.
What'd you think?
It's an interesting concept. The mesas and buttes being petrified tree trunks really makes you think. But as far as I know, I'm not a scientist. I'm not an expert in earth science, but these are supposed to be natural formations caused by erosion of rock. I'm not sure what the process is scientifically. I've never actually seen one happen. Obviously, it takes time. But if what this guy is claiming is true at all, then the concept of the world tree needs to be taken literally.
Right. So that's why I wanted to run it by you, right? So
yeah.
Anyway, so tell me about what you said it was the world tree?
Yeah. The world tree is pretty ubiquitous in mythology. Everybody knows the most famous one, the Yggdrasil of Norse myth. And the Altai peoples have theirs, and they situate it in the middle of Asia, in Central Asia. But the Garden of Eden holds on to that concept too, with the tree of life, accompanied by the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And it's also found in a Celtic Egyptian text called the Colburn Bible. And in that garden, there's a tree of wisdom and a tree of trespass. And underneath the tree of trespass grows what's called a lotus of rapture, which is the same concept of a hallucinogenic that I detailed regarding the Garden of Eden fruit. And trees have a very strong connection with enlightenment and creation. For example, the Savior was crucified on a tree. In the poetic Edda, the elder Edda, Odin sacrificed himself by hanging himself to the Yggdrasil and wounding himself with a spear. And we see that in the incarnate God in Christianity, when Jesus was nailed to a cross of wood with a spear wound.
Now, in mythology, do they make reference to the size of the trees? Did they say?
Yeah.
Yeah, they do. Okay.
Yeah, the world tree, call it what you will, is the tallest trees on earth. It towers into heaven, and its roots reach into the underworld. So it's also this concept of tying the three worlds together, heaven, underworld, hell, call it what you like, and Middle Earth. And, it's called Middle Earth because it's in the middle of the two other realms. And it's supposed to tower above all other trees. Like if one of those mesas or buttes were a tree trunk, and you can imagine how the size of that tree, like the guy in the video said, all the forest and all the trees below it resemble moss in comparison. That's how large these are.
It was mind-boggling when I watched it,
Yeah.
Because it was a paradigm shifter if it's true. But I just wanted to get your perspective on, because you're an expert in mythology, whether this was something that was talked about, and it is, as you've mentioned, it is. Is there any place else? You said Egypt, you said the Norse, the Bible, anything else that you can recall?
The Chinese have theirs. Other cultures have theirs too, but what I really wanted to get into was the concept of creation with the world tree concept. Like I said, he sacrificed himself, and that's an allusion to the Jesus crucifixion. And in Roman mythology, the savior is Bacchus, which in Greek is Dionysus, and they're all synonymous. The word book actually comes from this. Book is diminutive of Bach, which is Bacchus, and he's known as Liber, which means book, but he's also known as a letter or a tree. And the tree, Bacchus is the tree as a crucified flower plant, which is a rose on a cross, which is where we get the Rosicrucian symbol.
Okay.
But Jesus on the cross, he's said to come from Nazareth, but the word Nazir means flower, a flower. And there's a reproductive metaphor that ties in with this and the concept of hell, hell being the Norse goddess. If we take this goddess concept tied with the tree, then we have in the reproductive organs, the hymen is protected by the gates of hell, as it were. And the labia minora is the gates itself, and the Cerberus guarding the gates would be the clitoris. But the rose on the cross is actually the ovum, which the serpent or spermatozoa impregnates the virgin with. So it's also a reproduction metaphor in an esoteric interpretation. Trees also bring salvation and also life. The bark on which a book was originally written is Liber, like I said, and trees are what's known as the book of life. In the very beginning times, language began with trees, and the Chaldean name for a trunk of the tree was alpha, which is the beginning of the word alphabet, the root. The leaves people wrote letters on the leaves, and the branches were then words, and the fruit of the tree were its doctrines, hence knowing good and evil in Eden. And the Gnostics called Jesus the tree of life, and the Christ was called the branch, the vine, and the way of salvation. And the vine is the same vine that Satanael planted while the garden was being constructed, which grew up into that tree. And the goddess is also Lucifer with the Venus connection, which we went over last time. And so you have this whole interconnection of a goddess giving enlightenment to another goddess figure, Eve, which it's just a cyclical thing. It's like a Gordian knot.
Well, another question I had for you was when we did the show, you had said that Enlil, which is Yahweh, right?
Yeah.
When he took Adam and Eve and booted them from the Garden of Eden, you had said that he had put them into essentially a vast wasteland. They got kicked out of the garden. And is there any description of what that garden looked like? Because it was very interesting to me. I thought to myself, wow, when I watched this video, going back to the discussion I had with you, well, maybe this outside of the Garden of Eden, there was this quarry, this mining type of environment where essentially, I mean, there was really no way to survive, or it was going to be very, very challenging or difficult to survive because the land had been stripped. So is there anything in mythology that would allude to what the land looked like outside of the Garden of Eden, or in other mythologies, whatever they consider the Garden of Eden to be? What would it be like outside of that garden?
Yeah, the outside of the garden, because the Garden of Eden was an enclosed structure. It was artificially built. It was a greenhouse for the gods. And outside of it was a wasteland, and there are descriptions, like in the Jewish Haggadah, and pseudepigraphical works have sparse descriptions too. And yeah, it was a wasteland, but that was a consequence of the death of the land itself from the Mount Toba eruption around 75,000 years ago. If we are to assume this all took place in Mesopotamia, because the ash of that explosion reached, was it more than 1,000 miles, and covered it significantly.
Right, but you heard what he said about volcanoes, right?
Yes.
And he said that basically a volcano is nothing more than a big pile of earth that's covering up a bunch of waste from the quarry, which could include types of materials that could erupt and explode. And I know some of this is kind of like difficult to like, maybe even difficult to take seriously when you start talking about it, but because we're not accustomed to this explanation. But I get, you answered my question now. Now, you know, that it was described as a wasteland. One of the things that we've been talking about and discussing is that where did the quarry waste go? In other words, they were mining something. So whatever they were mining, where did it go? Where did they take it? When you were talking about the Garden of Eden being enclosed and being specially built, we started to think that perhaps from a flat Earth perspective, I'm talking about the flat Earth, right? One of the theories in flat Earth is that we are not being told the truth about the Earth with regard to all of the land, that there could very well be more land. And in fact, I found an article that was in a newspaper going back to, I think it was 1907. And it was published in a newspaper, and it said, is this the real map of the world? And what it showed was there was a circle around the land masses that we know today as, South America, North America, Europe, and so on, Australia. And then outside of that circle, they had these plots of land. I mean, we would call them continents, I guess. So I'm just wondering if there's anything in mythology that says that there's any place else other than the Earth that we have been told, or the Earth that the mere mortals reside in versus where the gods reside. Maybe that's a way to phrase it.
Well, where the gods reside has always been assumed to be outer space, or the heavens, as it's called in the texts. But my research has shown that they live inside the Earth. Okay. They're chthonic, demonic beings, which is where the concept of the traditional demon comes from, I think. If the Earth is a quarry, where did all that rock go? I'm not really sure. But, there's always a quarry site for an ancient megalithic structure. So if I had to assume something, it would have to be that the Earth is a quarry to have built the temples for the gods, which eventually became destroyed.
So the temples of the gods would be like what? I'm sorry for my ignorance.
No, just literal temples, dwarfing what we have now, of course. Everything in the mythological times, if we take it as a record of prehistory, everything was much larger and much more grandiose, and that's mostly due to the fact that there was no monetary system to control people with. It was a very, very different time, because we're very limited by how much money we have these days, and we have been for a long time now. But in the Mesopotamian mythology, the quarries were underwater. The mining operations of the faction of Anunnaki called the Agigi, which were laborers, they toiled in the mines of the Apsu, and the Apsu was underwater. The word Apsu means nether sea. So if there are quarries, then they're going to be found at the bottom of the oceans.
Okay, so that's the question I was going to ask you too. In the Sumerian texts, what do they say about any of this? Does anything in the Sumerian text talk about trees? You just said that does talk about mining. Anything about trees? Big trees?
Yeah, in one of the myths of Inanna, she found a tree that she really liked, and she wanted a throne to be made out of it. And there's a little story that goes along with that, because Lilith, who disappeared from the Garden of Eden because she wanted equality, ended up in this tree. It was called the Halupu tree. And she made a residence up there with some other creatures. And it was up to Gilgamesh to get her out, chop down the tree, and give it to Inanna, which he did. Other than that, there's not a whole lot, to be honest.
Okay. All right. I just, like I said, I'm just poking around and seeing, because we're just, we're not sure about this, to be honest. I mean, it's intriguing, obviously. It's very interesting. We're going to do a show. We're going to kick it around. We're going to record the show next week. And then we're going to just, I guess, take it from there. And like I said, if it wasn't for the fact that they had the hexagonal shape of the piping or the strands going down these large giant trees, we'll just call them that for now, then I probably would not have given this a lot more thought. But that's what got me, because that was clearly not lava.
Right.
Clearly not lava. So, am I pronouncing it right? Is it Yggdrasil?
Yeah, it's either that or Yggdrasil. I believe the Y is pronounced like an I.
Oh, Yggdrasil. Yggdrasil. Okay. I just pulled a page up here, and I guess that is probably, would you think, like the best example of what this could have been?
I would say so.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, that's the best known world tree. It's always been depicted as something towering above everything else, and to a massive extent.
Okay. All right. So I think what we'll do is, for the show, we will weave this in. We won't go any further, because I don't want to make a fool out of everybody or myself. So we'll talk about this.
I can give you a little bit more information about these trees if you like, but
yeah. I mean, do you have more?
I have a little bit more.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, tell me. Yeah.
So back to Bacchus, he symbolized with the Greek letters, iota, eta, and sigma, and anglicized it's IHS, and that is the logos, or the word. And in John 1:1, we read that in the beginning there was the Word, and the Word was God, and this is what created everything. In Old Irish, back to Liber as a book, the Old Irish words for book and alphabet are both described with the letters AUS, os, signifying tree and knowledge. The IHS is the logos, the lingua and letters of the leaves of the tree. And Bacchus was called Ros, rose, it means rose, and he was the water rose, going back to the hymen metaphor. Now, Hathor, the goddess in Egypt, was known previously to that name as Athor, which is where we get our word author. So that's why God in the Bible, giving forth the logos, the word, is the author of creation. It ties in with this tree concept. And the tree is also a form of creation. The goddess is the tree in some mythologies, and the goddess is what gives birth to us. So, and there's an African myth also that a primordial tree gives birth to the first race of people. So there's a correspondence there too, and that's something that I don't think many people would pick up on. But everything ties together.
Well, I'm taking notes, and so I'm going to have to stare at them and piece some of this stuff together. If I have any questions, is it okay to email you with some of my questions?
Of course.
Okay. All right. So you know a lot about this stuff, so it's very impressive.
Well, I'm glad you're impressed.
Okay, Doc. Well, thank you so much for looking into this.
All right. Thanks for having me on.
All right. Bye-bye, Priscilla.
All right. Bye.
And that concludes another Sage of Quay interview, and I hope you enjoyed the discussion as much as I did. Links to my guests' websites and social media are listed in the show notes below. And as always, I'd like to thank everyone for listening and visiting the blog. You can get to the blog by typing in sageofquayradio.blogspot.com, or simply head over to our hub website at sageofquay.com. Also, if you get a moment, please visit laboroflovemusic.com to listen to my album, Leaving Dystopia. And remember, live in truth and always serve creation. It's really that simple. See everyone next week. Be safe, enjoy, and God bless.